Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Mitchell, and I'm a senior security researcher in the Counter Threat Unit in Secureworks. And the CTU is a team of researchers whose day job is to understand the threat to Secureworks customers from both hostile and cybercrime actors. And my specific focus is on cybercrime, and I spend a lot of time looking at ransomware. In episode 1 in this series, I spoke about Operation Kronos, which was the law enforcement disruption of the LockBit ransomware as a service. And in September, we saw the third phase of that operation, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So I will go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. Okay, looks good. So I'll very briefly recap phase 1 today, cover phase 2 of Operation Kronos, and then provide some more detail on phase 3. And then I'll go through the impact of that collective activity that has been on LockBit and also the wider ransomware ecosystem. So phase 1 took place in February this year, and it involved the initial takedown of the ransomware scheme. Phase 2 was in May and involved an indictment and sanctions levied against the LockBit administrator. And phase 3 exposed the group's links to a notorious, long-standing threat group called Evil Corp. But first, just a quick reminder of who LockBit are. So Gold Mystic is the group that we assign this particular kind of activity. And Gold Mystic started the LockBit scheme in mid-2020, but actually used ransomware of a different name in 2019, albeit at a very low level. LockBit itself didn't really get going until mid-2021 with the release of the LockBit 2.0 ransomware. And since then, the group has been prolific, naming a far higher number of victims than any other over the course of its operation. And thousands of victims have been impacted by affiliates deploying ransomware and stealing data. And to coincide with phase 1 of Operation Kronos, we in the CTU published a threat analysis that covered the 22 LockBit compromises our incident response teams had been engaged in over the previous few years. So this is the screen that confronted visitors to the LockBit leak site on February the 19th, 2024. Law enforcement, led by the United Kingdom's National Crime Agency, replaced the content with a seizure notice. And they promised to reveal more about the operation the next day. And what followed represented quite a significant departure from what we'd seen previously with law enforcement disruption efforts. The NCA firstly announced the seizure of infrastructure associated with LockBit, including the custom Steelbit data exfiltration tool, the seizure of assets, such as cryptocurrency wallets, the arrests of some individuals associated with the operation, although the arrest of the LockBit administrator was notably absent. They offered victim assistance in the form of a recovery tool and the potential offer to decrypt data. And arguably the most interesting element was an attempt to cause reputational damage to the LockBit administrator, who goes by the handle LockBitSup, by undermining the credibility of the operation. And this included spoofing the LockBit leak site itself and claiming that LockBitSup had now been banned from his own website, and this followed their ban from 2 underground forums. The NCA also sent messages to affiliates suggesting that any law enforcement interest in them was as a result of LockBitSup's poor operational security. And I mentioned that we had produced an analysis based on the LockBit engagements, and you can read that report via that QR code if you're so interested. So the culmination of law enforcement activity was revealed in phase 2 on May the 7th, when the leak site was briefly resurrected. As in the first phase, a series of tiles explained what had been undertaken. And the most important thing here was the revelation of the identity of LockBitSup as Russian citizen Dmitry Koroshev, and the unsealing of an indictment against him and issuing sanctions. Obviously, the indictment will significantly limit Koroshev's foreign travel capabilities, but if he stays where he is in the city of Voronezh, he is unlikely to be arrested. But the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctions can be a particularly powerful tool, as they effectively make paying a ransom following a LockBit ransomware attack illegal in jurisdictions where those sanctions apply. So this would obviously seriously limit the opportunities for LockBit Sup and his affiliates to make money from their illegal activities. And the second stage, phase 2, also included a wrap-up of the NCA's findings from the investigation and the operation. It revealed some interesting information about the LockBit operation, which I'll come on to later when we assess the impact of Operation Kronos. And then in phase 3, which took place in September this year, there were more arrests, more lessons learned from the investigation, and unsurprisingly, more trolling to cause reputational damage. But most interestingly was a report on the group's links to Evil Corp and a new indictment and new sanctions. So a bit more detail on phase 3. A subject was arrested at an unknown location while on holiday outside of Russia, and that arrest was made at the request of the French authorities, and he was allegedly a LockBit developer. And 2 people were arrested in the UK. One was an alleged affiliate of the LockBit engaged in blackmail, unlawful computer access and money laundering, while another was arrested on money laundering offences. And the NCA explained that they continue to use the information gained in their compromise of the LockBit operation to further investigate criminal activity, and they will claim they will use it to continue to pursue the individuals involved. And in a series of screenshots taken from their analysis, the NCA again highlight that LockBit did not delete data from his servers once they received ransom payments as promised. And the messaging here is clearly designed to cause further reputational damage to LockBit and encourage any future victims not to pay ransoms on the basis that this individual cannot be trusted and won't follow through with his promises. But there was nothing kind of particularly new in phase 3 beyond the links to Evil Corp. And this is where the NCA took the opportunity to announce the relationship between Gold Mystics LockBit and Evil Corp. And one of the members of Evil Corp was identified as an affiliate of the LockBit Ransomware as a Service scheme. So how did law enforcement explain the connection between these 2 groups? For a start, they created a microsite that detailed the Evil Corp links. They included press releases, information establishing that a member of Evil Corp acted as a LockBit affiliate, and an expansion of the sanctions against group members and the indictment of the new individual, this affiliate. So who are Evil Corp? They're a very well-established group of cyber criminals we track as Gold Drake, and its members originated from a group calling itself the Business Club that operated between the mid-2000s and 2014. And the group was responsible for developing and deploying the prolific Dridex, also known as Bugat V5 botnet. And this was seen as the successor to the Business Club's Game Over Zeus Trojan, which was taken down in 2014 with the help of Secureworks. And Dridex itself was temporarily taken down, again with Secureworks' involvement in 2015. But Goldrake was able to resurrect the botnet and to continue to use it in a variety of campaigns. The group also started to engage in ransomware operations, starting with the BitPaymer ransomware variant. But because of the indictments and sanctions against the group members in 2019, the group shifted its ransomware operations to a variety of schemes. As I've said, sanctions make ransom payments effectively illegal for organizations incorporated in the territories issuing those sanctions. So the group attempted to circumvent these restrictions by acting under a different ransomware. So they moved from BitPaymer to Wasted Locker, then they used Hades, and then finally onto ransomware called Payload.bin. And the most important member of the group is a Russian national called Maxim Yakubets, and he was one of the individuals that was sanctioned in 2019. He was instrumental in the development of Game Over Zeus and Dridex and the running of the Evil Corp Gold Drake threat group. And the new sanctions issued still center around his importance as a key figure and highlight how the group is more akin to an organized crime family than a group of young cyber criminals working towards a common purpose. And at the time of the phase 3 takedown, we published our own understanding of the structure of the group, its involvement in cybercrime, and its links to LockBit. And you can read that report, that QR code. So what are the links between LockBit and Evil Corp? So only one new individual was named in the new indictment in the latest phase, and this was an Evil Corp member identified as Alexander Ryzhenkov. He allegedly acted as a LockBit affiliate nicknamed Beverly. And he was responsible for 60 LockBit builds, and that means he deployed or intended to deploy ransomware at 60 different organizations, which resulted in him attempting to extort over $100 million. And it's not clear how successful these attempts were. However, given that the NCA previously reported that 114 of the 194 LockBit affiliates that were working with the group prior to the February takedown did not make any money, it's likely that Beverly or Ryzhenkov was one of the more prolific affiliates. And interestingly, the indictment unsealed against him was for his involvement in deploying BitPaymer ransomware rather than LockBit. But it's possible that as the investigation continues and more evidence is laid out, such activity will be added to the indictment. So as I said, Ryzhenkov was the only indictment in this round of activity, but many more individuals were sanctioned by the US, UK, and Australian authorities this time around. A total of 16 individuals were sanctioned for their involvement in Evil Corp activities, and 2 companies were also added. The NCA detailed the relationships between members of the group, which centered on Maxim Yakubets, highlighted there in red. And this list includes associates and employees who were on the payroll and were engaged in the development of Evil Corp tools and criminal activity. And some of the listed individuals are members of Yakubets' family. Victor Yakubets is Maxim's father. And in a doorstep interview with the BBC in 2021, he actually denied that his son was engaged in criminal activity. Sanctions were also extended to Maxim's brother, Artem Yakubets, and his cousins, Kirill and Dmitry Slobodsky. And Maxim's father-in-law was also on the list, and he is an interesting character. I'll talk a little bit about him briefly. So Edward Bendersky owns the 2 sanctioned companies, Vimpel Assistance and Solar Invest. And it transpires he is a very well-connected individual. So firstly, he is the chairman of the Vimpel Charitable Fund for former FSB Spetsnaz officers, Spetsnaz being the special forces of the Federal Bureau. And according to Bellingcat, Bendersky organized the assassination of a Georgian dissident in Berlin in August 2019. And Vadim Krasikov, he was prosecuted and imprisoned for committing that crime, but was released in August 2024 as part of a high-profile prisoner swap between the US and Russia that took place in August this year. And you may remember that the prisoner swap as it involved some high-profile releases, particularly of a Wall Street journalist named Evan Gershkovich. And as an aside, Krasikov was warmly greeted by Vladimir Putin upon his return to Moscow, given a big hug on the airfield. So Bendersky allegedly holds considerable sway in the Russian state, and his support and protection of Gold Group members provides them the freedom to operate without unwanted interference. But does that mean that Evil Corp activity is effectively state-directed through this individual, through Maxim Yakubets' father-in-law? Well, probably not. The NCA reassert that Russian intelligence services tasked the group with conducting cyber attacks and espionage against NATO allies in 2019, but they don't provide any further evidence of similar activity. And the evidence for that in the first place was not particularly strong. So while the NCA's analysis paints a picture of the links between Russian cybercrime and the Russian Federation's intelligence services, these revelations in phase 3 did not definitively establish state-directed tasking of cybercrime groups. And as I said, it's more likely, given the considerable sway Bendersky has, that his support for Evil Corp allows them the freedom to operate without unwanted interference. So that's the detail on phase 3 of Op Kronos, and I'll now consider the NCA's claims about the impact on LockBit and whether or not this has been borne out in the data we've seen. And then I'll look at the impact on the wider ransomware ecosystem. So let's look at the impact on the LockBit ransomware as a service scheme. So firstly, the NCA claimed that LockBit is suffering from reduced operational capability, and also that it's lost affiliates. The NCA claimed that during phase 2 of Op Kronos, the RUS scheme went from having 194 affiliates prior to the initial takedown to just 69 by the time of phase 2. And the National Crime Agency also stated that LockBit affiliates have engaged in fewer attacks, and that the leak site contains duplicate victim data likely to boost numbers and give the impression of ongoing strong activity. And it also alleges that 2/3 of the, as the NCA describes, significant large victims listed are fabrications, although the NCA doesn't actually provide an explanation of what it means by that. But in any event, what does the data tell us about these claims? Well, for a start, we can see a significant reduction in the number of victims named on the LockBit leak site. There was an immediate drop after the initial takedown in February 2024. And this makes sense given that the LockBit infrastructure was down for a few days. I think 4 or 5 days it was completely offline. There was a big surge in victim names posted on one day immediately after the naming of LockBit SUP in phase 2. Although some were duplicates, many were unique victim names. But they may have been fake, as the NCA suggests, however. LockBit does have previous form for bunching a lot of victims together and uploading their details in one day. Anyway, the low level of victim naming continued through September when phase 3 of Op Kronos took place. And in October, just 2 victims were named. So clearly there's been a significant impact on the LockBit operation. And I thought it would be interesting to look at the impact of the sanctions on LockBit victim locations. As I've said, because they effectively make paying a ransom illegal in the UK and US, you might expect the proportion of victims in those countries to drop. The argument being, what's the point of ransoming an organization when you know there's little chance of getting a payout? And this is why groups like Evil Corp, as I spoke about earlier, rebrand their ransomware to evade those sanctions. So it's interesting to see that there has not really been a shift. US entities continue to represent by far the highest proportion of victims at around 35 to 45% of the total. And this may lend veracity to the NCA statement that many of the named victims are fake. So that's the impact on LockBit specifically, but what about the wider ransomware ecosystem? How have other groups fared as a result of these takedown efforts? So here's the number of victims named each month across all name and shame leak sites over the past 2 years. But first, we need to get rid of that blip from March 2024, this year. And a group named Dispossessor listed 330 victims in that month, but they were already named on other leak sites. They were relists of victim names, and this included some from LockBit. So now that's removed, we can see that the victim naming has been relatively stable over the last 18 months. And this actually bucks a trend whereby victim naming has been steadily increasing over time. And numbers in 2024 have not really recovered from the lull we always see over the Christmas holiday period. And it seems possible that the LockBit takedown is partly responsible for this. Although it's also important to mention around this time was also the disappearance in March of the Black Cat ransomware as a service scheme. And they're another prolific group, and it likely had its own impact on the landscape. So the data in the next few slides covers the period up to and including August this year. And at face value, it looks like a lot more new schemes entered the ecosystem after the LockBit takedown following a period of relative stability. So the green-blue bars represent the number of schemes listing victims for the first time in a particular month, and the orange line is the total number of schemes listing victims. July saw the highest ever number of schemes operating at 49. And we did also see a lot of new schemes emerge after the LockBit takedown, 38 to be precise. And here they are. It's important to note that we do see regular fluctuations, new schemes enter the ecosystem all the time, and some are very short-lived, posting victim names for just 1 month, or even just on one particular day, and then disappearing as quickly as they emerge. So for example, of the 69 schemes posting victim names to leak sites in the year September 22 to August 23, 27 were then not listing victims at all in the following year. But you can see a similar trend last year. The fact is it's generally pretty quiet around the Christmas holidays, so fewer new schemes enter the market around the same time each year. Then that leads into a bit of a surge in the middle of the year. So are there any other data points that make what's happening this year a little bit clearer? What helps us understand the trend in what's going on? What would be a more meaningful comparison? So let's have a look at how the number of schemes operating impacts the number of victims listed. The green line here is the number of victims listed each month, and the blue bars indicate the number of ransomware schemes listing victims each month. And you can see that reflects the overall upward trend over time in the number of schemes listing victims. So in 2023, as the number of schemes listing victims increased, so did the number of listed victims. While in 2024, the number of victims listed stayed fairly constant while the number of schemes operating increased. So this means that although new schemes are entering the market, the number of victims is not commensurately increasing. And this suggests evidence of fragmentation, more schemes listing the same number of victims, likely by using around the same number of affiliates. And this was likely caused by the disruption following the LockBit takedown and the Black Cat exit scam, both of which have damaged the reputations of the two biggest ransomware groups at the time, and also obviously their ability to operate. And we can see further evidence of this fragmentation in the spread of victims across leak sites. So year on year, September 22 to August 23, and September 23 to August 24, we saw an overall increase in the number of schemes naming victims from 69 to 90. And the spread of those victims changed across the top 20, top 10, and top 5 groups over time, with each having a lower share year on year. And ignoring the names of the groups, let's look at the status of each position in the top 20. For the top 9, the share of each position dropped, while for the next 11 schemes in the top 20, the opposite was true. 2023 to 24 saw an increase in the proportion of listed victims. This means that there was a more even distribution of named victims in that year compared to the previous year. And here we have the data updated to the end of October this year. And it is affiliate dispersion to new schemes that fills this gap. Ransom Hub clearly dominates this picture, but we can see the other schemes have also had an impact. Since the disruption of LockBit and Black Cat, we can see that victim numbers from the introduction of new schemes have steadily increased. And including Ransom Hub, these schemes account for over a quarter of all the victims listed since the end of February 2024. Let's have a look at a few case studies of the different schemes to see how they're performing. So first we have Killin, which is operated by a group we track as Gold Feather. So the group started listing victims in October 2022, but then added no more names to the leak site for a few months. Then in February 2023, a user on the RAMP underground forum called Heiser advertised the Killin ransomware as a service. And in April 2023, more victim names were listed on the leak site. And this continued at an average of around 5 a month to the end of that year. And then in December 2023 was the law enforcement Black Cat disruption. And after that, we started to see an increase in victim naming on the Killin leak site. Then after that, we saw phase 1 of Operation Kronos, the LockBit takedown in February 2024, which was quickly followed by the Black Cat exit scam, which resulted in the shuttering of that operation. And we can see that from this point, the number of named victims continued to rise. It's likely that some affiliates made homeless by these two disruptions prompted these increases in victim numbers. Although phase 2 in May does not seem to have had a marked effect, perhaps the damage to LockBit's reputation had already done enough to undermine its operation. And it's too early to tell if phase 3 will have an impact. Although October is low, there were a bunch of victims named on November the 1st, and groups can be slow to catch up on their administration. So let's look at the most prolific group, Ransom Hub. This is undoubtedly the biggest beneficiary of the takedown. Ransom Hub now dominates with the highest number of named victims, and it was formed in the immediate aftermath of Op Kronos phase 1 in February and has steadily climbed since. Another beneficiary is Play Ransomware. It saw a lot of victims named the month after the LockBit takedown and coincided with the Black Cat exit scam. And victim naming has remained relatively constant and consistent since then. And finally, Black Suit, which is ransomware that was rebranded from Royal Ransomware. Again, a big boost to victim naming following the LockBit takedown and Black Cat exit scam. But what's interesting about both Play and Black Suit is that they're not operated as ransomware as a service, meaning that theoretically affiliates didn't move from LockBit or Black Cat to those schemes. So what does that mean? Well, it's possible that the demise of LockBit and Black Cat means there are more accesses available to buy from initial access brokers on underground forums, or it may mean that those affiliates have actually been subsumed directly into those private groups. It's not really clear from the data, we can't make a determination. But interestingly, we've also seen the emergence of more independent ransomware operators in our incident response engagements. And we've seen recent cases where data is stolen and ransomware is deployed without attribution to a known group. They don't use Tor-based leak sites to expose victim names, and they use alternatives to Tor-based negotiation panels to communicate. In this case, it was a Tox ID they provided to communicate. In another, they suggested email, a proton.me email address by way of communication. And what was interesting about this particular case was the level of detail in the ransom note that explained the action the attackers had taken in the compromise. And this was likely done to convince the victim of the extent and seriousness of the intrusion. And in another case, we saw email addresses used for communication. And the ransom note here did resemble that of a group called Underground Team, but it didn't link to that group's infrastructure. So it's likely borrowed the style of that ransom note rather than being linked to that group. So what are the advantages of operating independently from known and established ransomware schemes? Well, they're lower profile, so there's less scrutiny. Activity is harder to track as it's not so attributable, and especially if you're using a leaked code for ransomware binary. And you also don't need to rely on third parties to protect you, which theoretically means a reduced chance of disruption from law enforcement activity. And the operators will also get 100% share of any ransom and will not need to pay a proportion of it into the affiliate scheme. The disadvantages, so without a leak site, it's more difficult to leak data and also use the threat of shame to induce victims to pay. There's no real ability to market, for want of a better phrase, a brand to add credibility to an operation. And obviously, the attacker needs to take care of the overheads for managing their own infrastructure and for developing and buying or using their own tools. So let's sum up overall what this analysis tells us about the impact of Operation Kronos. So first, we can see that LockBit operations have been significantly impacted. And despite the obvious impact on victim numbers across all groups, instead of the ongoing increase, we've seen them level out. Ransomware clearly has not gone away, and it still poses a significant threat to organizations as other groups have proliferated and affiliates have continued their work elsewhere. There seems to be further fragmentation in the landscape, with operators going it alone, which has the effect of tightening operational security. And the movement and fluidity across schemes makes attributing ransomware attacks to specific affiliates harder for us as security researchers. But I suppose there is some good news. For all their impact, disruptions don't seem to have caused affiliates to change the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures they adopt in deploying ransomware that much. There are obviously some exceptions to that, like social engineering help desks and things we've seen with Blackbuster and Scattered Spider. But generally speaking, the same tried and tested methods still work. So we still see stolen credentials and the exploitation of vulnerabilities in internet-facing services as the most common access vectors. And the ransomware operations we see are not as sophisticated as they used to be. We see very little custom malware. Most rely on older tools and frameworks that are readily detectable or even off-the-shelf legitimate applications and native Windows utilities whose anomalous use can also be detected. And network-wide encryption events are rare. But it's important to note that even simple deployments can have a devastating impact, especially where organizations that rely heavily on virtualized environments have their VMware host taken offline by encryption. So what can we all do to protect ourselves from the threat? So prevention remains better than cure. That means ensuring you have a program to identify the potentially vulnerable services you're running and prioritize updates. Robustly implement multi-factor authentication as part of a conditional access policy. And by robust, I mean don't neglect legacy or contractor accounts, for example. And also to counter the kind of social engineering I've mentioned from groups like Scattered Spider, use a form of phishing-resistant MFA to counter that threat. And also, as I've mentioned, conditional access policies to prevent stolen session tokens being replayed. Monitor the network and endpoints to ensure you detect and alert malicious or anomalous activity, which means deploying an XDR solution like Taegis and having sight of activity on endpoints and receiving timely alerts are crucial for identifying activity that is the precursor to ransomware attacks. And even a small window of opportunity can be enough to take action and prevent devastating impact. And again, ensure that the EDR or XDR rollout is robust and does not overlook devices that might be used to stage activity. For example, we in Secureworks, our incident response teams, have observed LockBit affiliates in the past exploiting a networked training device and a proof of concept server that were not enrolled in EDR solutions to pivot into a network. And we in the Counter Threat Unit build out our understanding of these threats so that our customers benefit, and our learning is baked into the Taegis platform through various countermeasures. And now obviously we're sharing this information with you. To enable recovery, have backups that are compartmented from your operational network. And lastly, assume that you will be targeted with ransomware and practice as an organization about how you will deal with it when the worst happens. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll just stop sharing my screen and see if we have any questions. Almost out of time, so I'll just answer the one. So do you think that the intervention was ultimately worthwhile in LockBit? Doesn't seem to have been much of a success. I guess it depends really on what your definition of success is. Clearly, there's been a significant impact in the number of victims being targeted. So even though it looks like things have rebounded and they're returning to normal, there would have been clearly a period when the targeting was effective, and a lot of organizations would have been spared a devastating ransomware attack potentially. That means people not having such a bad day in the office. It means companies not losing money and letting their customers down. So I think it's had an impact. It's been positive to a degree. Obviously, things are still falling out of that, and we're now trying to address how we kind of adjust to changes in the landscape and any changes to how these groups operate, so we can ensure we continue to protect our customers from the ransomware threat. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks for